And welcome to day 2 of Canada's first Economic Recovery Summit, happening right here in Surrey, British Columbia. I'm Anita, Huberman, CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade, and we are focused on Surrey's economic recovery. Day 1 yesterday was just amazing, focused on Surrey's diverse industry base, and you're going to hear more later this morning. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. And thank you so much to our amazing sponsors of the Surrey Economic Recovery Summit. First of all, our premier sponsor is the accounting firm of MNP right here in Surrey, British Columbia. Our gold sponsor is SFU Surrey Campus, Simon Fraser University, and the Beedie School of Business. Our silver sponsors are Kwantlen Polytechnic University, right here in downtown Surrey, as well as the Port of Vancouver. And our bronze sponsor is the Downtown Surrey Business Improvement Association. Thank you so much for your sponsorship. You know, you're going to hear later on that we accomplished a lot yesterday. And of course, we only had about 3 weeks to organize this event, but we are moving at rapid speed to ensure that Surrey remains an opportunity city. Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia very soon. And we are, at the Surrey Board of Trade, one of 9 organizations on the Premier's Economic Recovery Task Force. We are identifying gaps and opportunities during the pandemic and also post the pandemic. We have been so lucky in British Columbia with the leadership that we have provincially, not only from a political realm, but also from a health realm. And both pieces need to run concurrently. And that has been a winning formula for our province and also for our city. I wanted to mention that Surrey is the fastest growing city in Canada. I mentioned Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia, and Surrey remains a powerful economic engine. And that is why this event is not only the ending, it is the beginning of a business continuity platform. And what that means, you're going to hear more later this morning. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending Surrey's Economic Recovery Summit, and to provide an overview of what happened yesterday and to participate in a bit of a dialogue with Surrey's business organization, please welcome back our moderator. He's from MNP. He's an executive in residence at the Beedie School of Business at Simon Fraser University. Please welcome Haroon Rashid.
Thank you very much, Anita. And Anita, why don't you actually stay for this part? I mean, I think we're waiting for the Premier to come, and you know, sometimes I can be a little bit long-winded. So when the Premier is here, you can cut me off and introduce him. So first of all, Anita, I want to thank you and folks like Heather and Jazroot and the rest of your team, because as you mentioned, we really started this, 3 weeks ago, and it started as a one-page idea. And in that time, your team has enabled us, the partners and I at MNP and all the collaborators, to come together and focus on content, while you and your team has really done a remarkable job of hosting us. One of the things that I think, Anita, we talked about was Surrey is one of the fastest growing cities and will become the largest city. But I think we also agreed, this started with your role on the BC, Economic Recovery Task Force. We need to have that broader perspective as well. And I'll kind of bring that in. But I like the point you made about what we're trying to do with this summit. So we're really trying to get beyond talking. And that's what we did yesterday. We brought in a number of leaders from various industries, and we created a very, very structured approach to getting collaboration from them. And James and Susan will talk about that a little bit in the MNP presentation. And it's really about us collectively. And I talk about not just government, but it's really incumbent now for us in business and our research and academic institutions to come together. And it's what Sue Page calls collaborative innovation. So we need to move forward in a much more focused, disciplined, and collaborative manner. And that's the process that we've just started. And I think you said it really well. This is the start of a journey, this summit. It's not the end. And the way we sort of brought that structure about is we've really focused on three areas, which is why do we need to change? So every leader yesterday talked about that. And that's the input we got from the business community as well, of why we needed to change. And we talked about the future opportunities. And really, and this relates back to your role on the task force, is so how are we going to move forward? So how do we create that roadmap collaboratively? And so let me just kind of take a regress a bit and take a step back. So what we need to do in Surrey and our urban centers is, as we'll find out later today, will vary from industry to industry. Having said that, when we look at British Columbia, we can't treat every part of British Columbia the same. We have to look at British Columbia and say, we've got urban centers like Vancouver and Kelowna and Surrey, but then there's remote communities like Fort St. John. And so one of the other initiatives that did very quickly with Julie Zybart, who heads up Fort John Chamber of Commerce, is we looked at the economic impact to them. And so we started a fast track program with them to see what reskilling needed to look like with the downturn in the oil and gas industry. So there's an opportunity here, not only within Surrey, to look at how we need to treat our various industries differently, but there's also an opportunity here for us to look at how our remote communities, that some of the solutions that we have here may not fit up in our remote community. So how do we change that? And we need to do that in a way without trying to do 17 or 18 things at once. So we need to get in collaboration with government and our research institutions, we in business need to figure out what are the 2 or 3 key priorities that we want to get done next quarter, and then the quarter after that. So instead of have 18 or 15 activities going on, we can focus on the 2 or 3 activities that we can work on, get it moving, and then that process for our recovery starts to snowball. And when I look back at the themes about why change, so I mentioned, Anita, the alignment that is being created amongst all the stakeholders and such is really built around the concepts of why change and future direction. And that'll help us figure out the roadmap. But if I look at why we need to change, I think everybody agrees that the future has almost been thrust on us. And so all of a sudden, we're finding out that COVID-19 has impacted us in a way, physically, psychologically, and emotionally, that all of us are trying to figure out, how do we move forward? And the reality is that we're going to have to change. And so when we talk about change, a lot of people focus in on process, but really change comes from attitude and the approach we take. And so people generally tend to be very fearful of change. There's a little bit of background noise, so I'm not sure who's got their mic on, but if you can mute it, that would be helpful. So if we look at why we're reluctant to change, we tend to be a bit fearful, but I really like what Dr. Ryan Darcy said yesterday. And what he indicated was that once you break a bone and it heals, it tends to be stronger. And that's the way we have to look at change. Right now, all of us have been impacted in a number of different ways. But if we want to develop resiliency, we have to think about the things inside of us have been broken. Now there's an opportunity for all of us to work together to rebuild. And when we rebuild, we're in such a unique position in Canada. If you look at the rest of the world and the turmoil going on, Canada is in a very unique situation. And when you cascade down to British Columbia, as you mentioned, Anita, you know, the leadership we've had, and I talked about Bonnie Henry yesterday and the impact she's had on all of us. And I think we also have to look at it irrespective of the political stripe. The leadership that's been provided by our current government is something that I think should be commended. And the leadership coming from a number of our business organizations, like Sue Page, who spoke yesterday, Jill Tipping was another one. They really offer us a very unique opportunity for us in British Columbia to actually move forward and become more productive than we've ever been and create very resilient communities where we even help a lot of the people who've been really disfranchised by COVID-19. And so I'll look forward to having Minister Mungall, given her background, sort of articulate, you know, us building that inclusive economy. The other thing I wanted to talk about, Anita, so if we look at how well Surrey is positioned, BC is positioned, we need to think about how we're going to incorporate helping our organizations and people reskill to make the transition into the future of the digital economy. And so given the solid foundation that we have in that, we need to think about, well, how do we go about doing that? And so I've said it, I think in my opening comments, it's about the articulation and the connection between government, business, and our academic institutions has to improve. And the other thing that we need to start doing, if we look at all the industry leaders who spoke yesterday, they talked about, Ian Toston talked about how our restaurant industry has been severely impacted, but all of a sudden the restaurant industry is becoming very innovative. We talked about some of the other industries, like Darcy talked about the huge, Dr. Darcy talked about the huge potential for our health sector, not just in BC, but in Surrey in particular, and some of the innovations they're coming up with. So I think this is a real opportunity, and we started yesterday with those leaders from the various communities coming together and cross-exchanging their ideas. A lot of those innovations that occur in one sector will also happen in, can be applied to another sector. And so today we're gonna have one of our speakers, Zabeen Hirji, and she's gonna talk about the ability for us to sort of cross-fertilize our ideas and accelerate innovation. And then we can talk about how we can reuse some of the things that have already been developed. So if I look at it, well, I think I was going to talk about Jill Tipping and what she was doing, but I see that that the Premier is here. So
thank you so much, Haroon. And we're so pleased to have British Columbia's Premier with us. I just wanted to mention that the BC government has been amazing in terms of their investments in Surrey, British Columbia. And of course, we have been an advocacy agent at the Surrey Board of Trade to ensure that those investments, not only for the business community, but also for our residents to enhance our livability, to position our infrastructure to be that opportunity city. And so we're so pleased, and I'm so honored to welcome and introduce British Columbia's Premier, John Horgan. John, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita, and it's great to be joining the Board of Trade again. I, of course, am in my office at the legislature in the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation. And the last time I spoke to a gathering of larger than 50 people was, I think it was March 12th at Surrey Board of Trade event. So as we announced earlier this week, moving to phase 3 of our restart plan, it's appropriate that I'm again, albeit in a different form, addressing members of the Surrey Board of Trade. It's great to be back, and I wish I could be there in person. And hopefully, as the summer progresses and we continue to do our best as a community to fight COVID-19 and keep our caseload down, we'll be able to meet in person in larger numbers in the not too distant future. As I said, restart of the economy has been going on for a couple of months now. I think it's important to preface that by saying that unlike other provinces in the country, we resisted the temptation to just lock everything down. I remember vividly numerous questions from the press at the time when other jurisdictions were closing everything. We took a different approach. Dr. Henry, Minister Dix, and I regularly looked at problems and came up with solutions to those problems rather than just saying, let's shut it down and worry about it later. And so areas like construction, for example, were allowed to continue in a safe manner, following guidelines from public health and the workers' compensation or WorkSafe BC. And I think that's been a big help to us on the economy side. And it has not had at all an impact on our case counts, which you all know have been going down. And although we had a bit of a spike yesterday, 20 cases, we've been in some days over the past 15 days as low as single digits. And that's a testament to the work of British Columbians to listen and take personal responsibility for themselves, for their communities. And that's a good news for British Columbia. So as we go into phase 3, we'll be seeing more businesses starting, and we'll see more travel. British Columbians can look forward to a summer of moving around within British Columbia and Canada for that matter. And I think that people are excited about that. I know I am. I'm looking forward to going and seeing some of the splendor that British Columbia has to offer. And so those participating today, if you had a plan or did not have a plan for a summer vacation, you might want to consider traveling to a part of British Columbia you've never been to before. But I encourage you to reach out to those communities, contact them, and see if there's space, see if there's a welcome mat being put out. I know many tourist attractions will be delighted to see more people. While we continue to have our international borders closed, it's critically important that British Columbians recognize that the business people that are their neighbors and their friends need our support. So wherever possible, please spend locally, travel locally, but be mindful that the practices and behavior that you would want to see in your own community need to be mirrored in the communities that you visit. So as we see more and more activity, obviously we're going to be taking greater risks, and we need to make sure we're managing those risks as individuals, as governments, and as businesses. And it's important, and over the past number of months, we've made it critical to us to reach out to as many British Columbians as possible. Anita, of course, is a member of the Economic Recovery Task Force, which consists of Vancouver Board of Trade as well, BC Business Council, BC Chamber of Commerce, Federation of Labor, not-for-profits, Indigenous peoples, and of course, Prem Gill, who was, I think, with you yesterday from Creative BC. So we've done our level best to speak to a cross-section of representative groups, Anita being representative of your table, as well as reaching out to over 1,500 different individuals, businesses, and others to hear their views on what they want to see as we reopen our economy and face a world that's quite different from the world that we talked about back in March. You'll remember then I was celebrating another balanced budget, the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the fastest growth rate, a whole host of economic indicators that spoke very, very favorably for our bright future together, not just in Surrey, but right across British Columbia. And those fundamentals are still well in place. Although the unemployment rate has spiked significantly, we still have a low unemployment rate. We have a skilled and diverse human resource or labor market that will allow us, I think, to get back to as close to normal as quickly as possible. And that's a testament to our post-secondary institutions, to our innovative economy, the tech sector, whether it be clean tech, life sciences, or any other endeavor. We seem to be leading the country in a host of different ways. And we're attracting more people to British Columbia as well, which puts pressures on our schools, puts pressure on our hospitals and our healthcare system. And that's why we're very proud to build to build and fund not one, but 2 urgent primary care centers in Surrey, as well as Minister Dix and I are hopeful that we'll be able to announce in the not too distant future, a couple months hence, the completion and the approval of a business plan for a 2nd hospital in Surrey. In addition to that, of course, we announced a quantum computing center at SFU Surrey that would make Surrey a 2nd downtown and a 2nd center for tech and innovation. These are all positive outcomes in the short time we've had in government to make sure that we put Surrey on the map as a dynamic community that's growing, it's multiculturally diverse, and it's focused on making sure that economic activity goes hand in hand with a dynamic, healthy, and prosperous province. And Surrey is going to be a key part of that. I know you're going to have a number of questions, so I just want to touch a little bit on some of the other issues that we've been focusing on. It often feels that all we do is think of COVID-19. It's critically important. My approach to this pandemic was to defer to those experts to give me the advice that we could deliberate on as a cabinet and then make decisions in the best interest of all British Columbians. Dr. Henry has been outstanding as a leader of public health. Minister Dix has been a friend of mine for 30 years. If I had to construct a health minister to guide us through a pandemic, I would have constructed Adrian Dix. We're very fortunate to have his dedication and his singular focus and intensity to detail to make sure that we do not overlook any of the details that are critically important to our well-being coming out of this pandemic. So I think we're in good hands. We share the information weekly at Cabinet. We have discussions about the way forward and we make decisions, but they're guided by the best advice we can get to ensure that all British Columbians can be comfortable, that our objective is to keep them well and that we move forward together. I'll just touch on the NHL for one moment. I'm a massively large hockey fan. We worked with the NHL and the Vancouver Canucks to put in place a bid to be a hub city for the playoffs this summer. We did everything we could to accommodate the needs of the NHL. And again, the Vancouver Canucks were outstanding to work with. But at the end of the day, the NHL seemed to want more than we were able to give in terms of protecting public health. So they made the decision to not come here. I regret that for the small spike in hotel business that would have arrived to the Lower Mainland. The Vancouver Tourism Association predicted several hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit from the hub city proposal. But that modest spike in a summer that will be challenging for hospitality and tourism wasn't sufficient to overlook the importance of protecting public health. So these are decisions about economy, about civil society, and about wellness for British Columbians that we're making every day, always focused on what's in the best interest of British Columbians. So with that, Anita, I'll thank you for the opportunity to address the board and take any questions you may have. I think Haroon, you're pitching the questions.
Yeah, I'm shooting the puck at you, Premier.
Okay.
So unlike you, I want to see the NHL come back, and disappointed they're not going to use our great province as a host. But
Their loss.
that's right. Premier, I wanted to say, I think in my opening remarks, I said yesterday, and I said it again today, it's Dr. Bonnie Henry's been the face of guiding us through these very surreal times. Minister Dix has done an amazing job, but I think, all of us, irrespective of political stripes, I think a lot of kudos to you individually and your team as a whole in terms of the comfort and guidance. It goes really beyond the economy in terms of the leadership you provided. So I wanted to thank you on the behalf of many British Columbians for that.
Thanks, Haroon. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and so I think, Premier, when we look at this is not a normal recession that we've seen in the past. it's created impact for different industries in different ways, and it'll continue to do so as long as we've got COVID-19 over us. So what's your view on sort of the path forward? I know you touched on it on some of your opening remarks, but maybe you could touch on it a little bit more.
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right that we have not been here before. The pandemic of 1918 is so far in our past. It was coming out of the First World War. So the 1920s were dynamic times, not because we were coming out of a recession, but we were coming out of a global conflict. Similarly, though, we are coming out of a global challenge. We are a small open economy. We're a trading province. We need to take our goods and services and sell them to the world, whether it be to the United States or to Asia or to Europe or anywhere else. We need to make sure that our trading partners are viable. And so the challenge we have is that in previous downturns in British Columbia, you could often point to one sector or another that was adversely affected by international events or by shifts in markets. But now it's the whole enchilada. It's every corner of the economy. So what we've been trying to do is to ensure that we're talking regularly with agriculture, forestry, mining, our traditional industries, as well as those transformative industries like tech, whether it be clean tech or life sciences and so on. But there's also the foundation of small businesses. And I think Minister Mungall is going to be with you either later today or, and she can speak about the Small Business Roundtable, which I've participated with her in. She's been speaking with them regularly. As I said, we're reaching out to make sure that retail, hospitality have got the tools they need to succeed. We worked with public health and WorkSafe to make sure that there were guidelines in place. Public confidence is critical to success in retail and hospitality. And if people don't feel comfortable to go into a business, that business is not going to succeed despite their best efforts. So we wanted to make sure that there was an understanding in the marketplace that we were ensuring health for employees, health for customers, whether it be going to grocery stores, going to other retail outlets, or going to get a bite to eat at a local restaurant. And reducing capacity in restaurants is going to be, has been, and will continue to be a big challenge for smaller operators. So we've made changes on issues like the ability to sell off sales. If you have a liquor license, to sell off sales with takeout meals, giving hospitality pricing so that small operators are able to purchase alcohol at the same rate that they would be purchasing at a wholesale outlet, a retail outlet rather. And that provides restaurants with a little bit more space. The margins are very tight in the restaurant business. We want to do what we can to reduce their input costs so that they can provide a product to the public that will allow them to keep operating. So those are the challenges. We've been really going sector by sector, and that's been an enormous challenge for us. But I also believe that it's the best way forward. There is no one size fits all to a dynamic economy like ours. And this is an unprecedented time. For those trade exposed industries, we've been working hard with our trading partners and the federal government to make sure that we're reducing obstacles in that regard as well. And I've mentioned the federal government. Yesterday was the 15th week in a row that the Prime Minister and the 10 premiers of the provinces and 3 premiers from territories have met by conference call to discuss the challenges, not just to public health, but to the economy. And that level of cooperation, Haroon, is quite unprecedented. I've been a member of the legislature for 15 years this month, and I've been observing politics since I became an adult. And I cannot recall a time in our history where there has been such cooperation between the orders of government in Canada. And that cooperation, I think, puts us all in a good place for cross-border issues, for interprovincial trade, and also just having a general understanding that we are indeed all in this together.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real positives, I think, not just in BC, but for us as Canadians to see the collaboration and across the country. And one of our speakers later actually is doing some work with Toronto Chamber of Commerce. So the idea of this initiative is actually to start connecting us across the country. And on that note, Premier, I wanted to say, we really started this process about 3 weeks ago. And when I first approached Sue Paish on it, she said, Haroon, this is, to try to get all these stakeholders together in the time you're proposing. I don't, it'll be a very challenging thing to do. She goes, but we do need to do it. So I was trading text messages with her last night, and she said she wanted me to tell you that we're making great progress. And so this is a start of a journey. And so what I'd like to ask you, so we've given you some background on the Surrey Summit. In your view, Premier, how does it fit into the overall picture of helping BC recover?
It's absolutely essential, Haroon. And you spoke about getting a better understanding of what's going on in Toronto. I think what we need to do now more than ever in our small open economy, not just in BC, but in Canada, is to look to opportunities domestically to continue to grow our various sectors and opportunities that we would have ignored in the past because we had other access to other markets really means that we need to be more focused and attuned to opportunity. As you know, from crisis comes opportunity, and this has been an extraordinarily challenging time for people, for businesses, for employees, for governments, municipal, federal, provincial, and we need to all recognize that. And one thing, Haroon, that I've discovered and what this summit allows us to do is to bring people together that have oftentimes been too busy to sit down. I've got to meet deadlines, I've got supply chains I've got to fill. Now we're reimagining what the economy would look like. I just had a call before I came on here with Governor Inslee in Washington State. And both he and I agree that this is an opportunity to not imagine how we get back to where we were, but to imagine where we can go with this blank canvas we have in front of us. And having dialogue like this and the 1,500 different people I've talked to, different groups I've talked to in the past number of months, sometimes multiple times, allows us to have a better understanding of our needs, our concerns, and our opportunities. And so this summit and others like it provide opportunities for people to hear ideas that they may not have thought about before, to connect with people that they may have not dealt with before, and create potential opportunities for linkages and collaboration that will lead to prosperity down the road. Our job as government is to ensure we're continuing to provide the services that we need: health, education, building our infrastructure, and we have a very robust capital plan that's not impacted at all by the downturn. We have dedicated those capital dollars to build transportation in the Lower Mainland, to build schools in Surrey, hospitals right across the province. That will continue. Oftentimes you hear the traditional Keynesians saying that you need mega projects in times of downturn. Well, we are very fortunate to have, in fact, if you'd asked me a year ago, what's your concern about your capital plan? It was finding the people to do the work. Sometimes we were only getting one bidder on projects. That pushes up costs and potentially has an impact on quality. We are not seeing that now. We have seen 4, 5, and 6 bidders on some projects that we were thinking we'd only have one. And now that leads to competition, it leads to better outcomes, and it will see more people going to work faster. So there's a whole bunch of hope ahead, but it's been a difficult few months, and there's a few more difficult months ahead of us.
Yeah, and Premier, I wanted to sort of build on that comment a bit. The whole idea of this summit is actually for us, whether we're academic and research leaders or business people. You made a point earlier on that as we come out of COVID, every individual is responsible for their health and how they conduct themselves. So I think part of this summit, what we're trying to do is just get away from just talking. So we've created action plans that we'll follow up with you and other members of your team. And I think as we move forward, the key for us is to think about the responsibility is really not for government you're there as facilitators. The responsibility really is for us in the business community and other parts of our ecosystem to start to come up with those ideas of how we can reimagine our society to start to move things forward. And so with that, I wanted to sort of give you another couple of minutes in terms of the challenges that you would put out to us as British Columbians of the way we can sort of support you to sort of move things forward.
Well, Haroon, you're absolutely right. I personally want to say that Anita has been a very active participant. As you can, Anita, you know that there's not too many moments where she's idle. And she's been giving task force members and government a whole host of ideas that have percolated up from the board. And then she's been distributing that information, not just to me and government, but to other industry leaders. And that's an enormous asset to us to have everybody pulling together. We live in a competitive economy. That's the essence of our economy, competing with others or providing the same services that you are. But collaboration also leads to great potential as well. And I think that the biggest challenge we have is making sure that we focus on those that have been most affected by COVID-19. And it turns out it's young people, it's women, it's people of color, and it's also those small businesses that were, on a line of credit to keep things going. They're going to have super huge challenges ahead. So that speaks to buy BC, buy local, engage with people who are your neighbors, who have businesses and need your support. Those are the challenges that we have collectively, is to make sure that those that have been most adversely affected are the ones that we try and lift up right off the bat. And so we have this September, for the first time in almost 20 years, non-refundable grants for students, $1,000 going back to get a degree, a certificate, start your trade. That's going to stimulate many people to skill and reskill for the economy that will come out of COVID-19. We need to do our job as government to make sure that the training spaces are there so that people can get a new start to a new career. But we also need to be mindful that many want to stay with what they have, and we need to be empathetic and respectful of those who want to get back to where they were. We can't dismiss that. We need to work as hard as we can to make people comfortable with the world that we will be inheriting, and of course passing on to our younger generations. And that's why we're going to be looking as a government at youth programs. There's no shortage of initiatives that were always characterized in the budget process. That would be nice to do if we had a little bit more money. Well, revenue is a big challenge right now. People and ideas are in surplus. We need to take those people and those ideas and harness them to get back on track, not just in Surrey, not just in British Columbia, but indeed across the country.
Premier, thank you very much. I mean, I think we're one of the messages you've delivered here. If we want to create a resilient society, we need to be not just embrace diversity, but take actions on diversity, and we need to be inclusive. So thank you very much for that very positive message. And thank you very much for taking the amount of time that you have with us to do this.
It's my pleasure, Haroon. I've spent a lot of time looking at screens these days. And I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity. It is an honor to have this. And as I said, I was speaking to Governor Inslee just a few moments ago, and both of us are, a bit shell-shocked by the challenges, but inspired by people. Of all the conversations I've had, and this is another example of that, Haroon, it's not about what can you do for me, it's what can we do together to lift us all up. And that's a fundamental value of British Columbians, and I'm proud and honored to have the opportunity to lead the government at this point, and a critical point in our history.
Well, great, and we look forward to moving this forward, and we'll be tapping you on the shoulder again in the near future and with future actions that we've taken.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye. Well, I think that was a very positive message from our Premier. And so what I'd like to do now is how are we going to move our economy forward? And so, and what are some of the issues that we need to consider as we do so? So we're going to go back to where we left it yesterday with, and I'd like Susan and James, Susan Mowbray and James Richardson from MNP to to join me here before you start projecting. And so Susan and James, you heard the Premier's comments, and I think, you know, I'd like to sort of do a shout out to both of you. I know you represent the MNP partners. A lot of time and effort has gone into this, but I think, you know, you've created a program that really is going to serve as a foundation for us to help get away from just talking and start to put in material that'll help us start to take action. So with that, why don't you take us through what your findings were in the last day or so?
Great, thank you, Haroon. It's a pleasure to be back with the Surrey Board of Trade. It was a busy day yesterday. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to come back to meet with us and go through what we learned from all the material that we've gathered. What I wanted to start with, though, was really just to think about, go back to what the premise that the summit is built on. And the premise that the summit is built on is that Surrey has a well-defined economic strategy that's built on the idea of digitally transforming its economic base and moving forward in that area. That vision is still relevant despite COVID, but the pathway has changed. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. And where that pathway has changed is in the areas of workforce development and how we provide support for local businesses to grow. And Premier Horgan had alluded to some of these things in his talk a few minutes ago. And so if we think about how we go about that, we talked yesterday about this being a journey, and we're really at the start of that journey. And that journey is not unlike how Premier Horgan described the government's approach to dealing with the COVID situation. The first part of that journey is really about problem identification, and that's the area of that journey that we are in right now. In the last 3 weeks, we've conducted a survey of businesses in Surrey to sort of understand, get a temperature check from them on what their experience has been in terms of some key areas. And then we met with you yesterday and talked about the results of that survey on a sector by sector basis so that we could understand if what we were hearing through that survey was really what reflective of what's happening within the sector, so that we could figure out what those pain points are. And so today we'll share what those pain points are, and from that information we were able to take the themes that came out and group them into 3 buckets. And those 3 buckets are opportunities to engage with government, then there's opportunities for collaboration, and then there's areas where there's still some more work to be done to really understand what that problem is. And from that, you can build those specific actions that are going to lead Surrey forward. So in terms of what we heard, this slide shows a summary of the findings. And where you see a check mark, that indicates where the survey results were confirmed through our discussions yesterday in the breakout sessions with industry representatives. Where you see an X, that indicates that the survey results were found to be relatively consistent with the experience of industry, but that there were some additional issues identified, and there was a broad consensus on what those issues were. Where we have a question mark, that is where there's still some more work to be done to really understand what's going on. And you'll see it's a mix. It's just like that idea that there's not one experience that any industry is going through. There's not one solution that's going to fit for all of these. But there are certainly some broad themes where there's opportunities to collaborate across sectors, and there's opportunities for specific sectors to work together to find solutions to those problems. So in terms of diving into some of the specifics of what we heard, in terms of workforce across multiple sectors, we were hearing about government income support programs. These are, in the view of business, these are disincentives for businesses to be able to draw back their labor force. People are deciding to stay home because they're making more, or they're making enough by accessing these programs, so they're not able to come back to work. Another theme was health and safety concerns about returning to work, and those were really in 2 areas. The first was transportation to and from work, and the second was the ability to maintain social distance within the workplace so that your staff felt safe. Then there was another theme that emerged, was uncertainty. And this was in the area of workforce. It was uncertainty about the future is affecting decisions on layoffs and hiring. And we heard some examples of businesses that had, expected significant drops in revenue, and so had proactively made the decision to lay some staff off. When those revenue declines did not materialize to the same extent they were expecting, they tried to bring their staff back, but at that point, the staff had either found new opportunities or decided that they didn't want to come back. So they were left a bit in a bit of a bind trying to find staff to fill their, to continue their operations. Another theme we heard was mental health. And that was across all sectors. There was concern about the mental health of their workers, not just from the stress of being at work and being concerned about getting COVID, but the stress of isolation of working remotely. In terms of specific sector issues, in manufacturing, in the manufacturing session, one of the things that came out was having to shift some of your operations to work remotely had never even previously been considered. But now in the new environment, manufacturers need to think about how can we shift some of our functions to being provided remotely. In terms of health, one of the themes that came out was, and this is something that we've heard a lot about as the COVID crisis has unfolded, is that compensation for those working in long-term care needs to be addressed, and we need to find ways to attract workers to long-term care. In terms of infrastructure and transportation, the issue of access to childcare came up, and that had impacted the ability of some businesses to be able to continue to deliver essential services because their workers no longer had access to childcare, and this was creating problems. Now, one thing to note about the sector-specific issues, these came out of the specific consultations with sectors yesterday. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily only specific to this sector. It's just that at this point in the process, we know that these are issues within this sector. They may also be applicable to other sectors. It's just that we haven't identified that based on the data that's been collected today. In terms of finance, some of the things that we heard was there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to the future. In the infrastructure and transportation sector, that's uncertainty about future government procurements. With respect to the creative sector, that would be the inability to operate at full capacity until phase 4. For them, their whole business model has changed in a lot of instances, that their way of working, so they're not quite sure how to deliver on that. You cannot have it where a performer may have been used to performing in front of a live audience. Now all of a sudden they have to shift to doing this remotely, and it's a totally different experience, not just for the performer, but also for the audience. So how do you bridge that? In terms of services, particularly around tourism-related services, one of the uncertainties was how long capacity constraints are going to be in effect that are, and that affects their ability to expand or to operate or how they operate. There's also concerns about long-term financial impacts related to deferred payments, bad debts, the increasing cost of labor, and increased costs of compliance. So those are all the sort of things that we heard from the finance section. When we talked to people about their supply chains and operations, what we heard was that the border closures and travel restrictions are certainly causing issues within certain sectors. In terms of how to deliver services remotely, this was an issue for health, education, and the creative sectors. I've already talked a little bit about the creative sector's whole business model having to change for certain live performances. But within the context of health, all of a sudden, the way certain services were being delivered to vulnerable populations was no longer an option. So how do you continue to reach those vulnerable populations in the current environment? Within education, one of the things that was really interesting to hear was that there's a big difference between some of the the experience of the larger institutions and the smaller private institutions. For some of the larger institutions, they were able to quickly move at a speed that they'd never thought possible to deliver classes online. And they came up with a smaller offering for the summer, but going forward in the fall, students are expecting a full suite of courses to be offered, and it's gonna have to be done remotely. So that's been a bit of a challenge. For the smaller education providers, they may have lost their market. So for instance, if they're language things, or if they're providing vocational training that requires hands-on, they weren't able to provide that. So it's a mix in that sector. There's a lot of diversity in the experience depending on what specific area you're operating in with it. And another common theme we heard was the need to adopt new technology and work with new technology across all sectors. In terms of expectations, in the short term, what we heard from businesses is that we should be focusing on that local area and building partnerships and collaborating. And that's along the lines of what we just heard from Premier Horgan about how we should be focusing on domestic opportunities that maybe we wouldn't have looked at before because there was other ones. That was consistent with what we heard in the short term from the business community here in Surrey. We also heard that government supports are needed by the creative sector and some of the services sector, as long as those border closures, travel restrictions, and gathering restrictions stay in place. And there's also, in the infrastructure and transportation sector, we heard there's a need to reduce government red tape and approval times. In the sort of medium term, that's that 2 to 3 years, what we heard is that there's a consensus that there's a need for the return of safe travel. There's also a need to adopt new technologies and ways of delivery. We need to increase comfort levels with technology within the workforce. And from the health sector, we needed to maintain access to shared data. The data sharing that's been happening to address COVID in terms of access to different what's happening in different areas has been key to solving and understanding the problem. And it's really in moving the health sector forward and identifying how to address some of the challenges with delivering things remotely and also efficiencies, it's really important that we maintain access to shared data. We don't go back to the way there was before. That's probably something that also applies to a number of other sectors where there could be some sharing of data that would allow them to address some pain points if they're willing to do that. But for right now, that was what we heard specific to the health sector. So in terms of how those themes all fit into those areas that I was talking about, those opportunities for engaging government and those opportunities for collaboration. If we look at the opportunities for engaging government, that would be on the design of the income support program. These are really government responsibilities, so they need to be the ones to address those, but we have an opportunity to engage with them so they understand some of the issues that are being created by those income support programs on the ground, so that they can balance those issues with the need to also provide support to vulnerable populations. There's also the issue of border closures and travel restrictions. That would be also something to engage with government on about how the best way to manage that going forward is. And then there's the targeted stimulus spending and supports to address long-term financial impacts and the streamlining of approval processes for removing red tape. So that's where we would see opportunities for Surrey to engage with government to help or to provide input as government goes about learning or addressing some of those issues. In terms of where there's opportunities for collaboration, I'll start with talking about where the opportunities are for supporting businesses to grow. And what we show here is there's really 4 areas where there was pain points across one or more sectors where there would be an opportunity for collaboration to address those. And this, once again, this list is not necessarily exhaustive. Some of these opportunities may apply to other sectors. It's just that based on the limited information we have at this point, this is what we were able to identify. The first of those opportunities is in terms of operating remotely. And this is where industries like manufacturing and the creative arts and culture sectors, they never really had to contemplate this before. And so there may be some learnings and some opportunities for collaboration with other sectors who've been successful at doing this to help them understand how to shift at least some of their operations to being remotely. This is also the case for education, mostly for some of those smaller or private institutions. And then there's, of course, infrastructure and transportation. And with health, it would be sort of in that delivery of those services to vulnerable populations. How do you continue to provide those necessary supports when you can't necessarily engage with people in the same way? So those are some of the opportunities for collaboration that we heard yesterday from the breakout sessions. Along the same lines is pivoting your customer base. All of a sudden, if you're a manufacturer, there was maybe particularly for some of the smaller manufacturers, you need to look at how to pivot your customer base, and maybe there's some learnings from other sectors about how they did that would help you understand how to do that. Pivoting your customer base was also something we heard in technology and with the education sector. Here again, with the education sector, a lot of that might be that might differ between our large publicly funded institutions and some of those smaller training providers that are privately funded. And also for services, this is where services and tourism related businesses may also benefit by collaborating to understand how other sectors have pivoted their customer base to respond to different conditions. Another potential area is in terms of safe workplaces. And this is really about those, part of this is for those sectors that felt that they couldn't have their staff working effectively remotely. So that would be in manufacturing, infrastructure, and transportation. And with health, it's really about providing assurances and redoing the models for how you're providing services. So there's opportunities there for collaboration about your operations when you still do have to have people in close contact. How do you do that safely? And then the final one was access to childcare for infrastructure and transportation businesses. Here, that one may also apply to other sectors, but it was something that was raised as an issue within infrastructure and transportation. And now I'm just going to turn it over to James and see, James, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, Susan, you're doing such a great job of presenting the facts and the analysis and what the data shows us coming forward on some of those issues. But on this particular one, I wouldn't want any one of us to lose track of the other insight that's presented on this slide. So where we've heard a lot of the speakers talking today about the way forward is going to be a collaborative way forward. And we've also heard all businesses have their businesses to run, and that takes a good chunk of their time and energy as well. So when you're saying, okay, so if we're going to collaborate on pivoting our customer base and market, what we've accomplished last couple of days is where are those big pain points that have been raised so far. So at a minimum, include manufacturing, technology, education, and the services to convene and collaborate, because it's going to be a pain point. So it's of interest, and therefore it will be of interest to convene and collaborate and look for those solutions. Don't exclude the others, and invite, but I think you can expect that those are going to be where the interest, and you're going to have your stakeholders involved in driving that forward. Such a great information that's coming from the Board of Trade membership, from the businesses, identifying where those problems and issues are, so we can start taking those targeted approaches to solving those problems. A problem identified is the beginnings of a problem solved.
Thank you, James. So now I'm going to turn to the other aspect of what we were looking at in terms of how to change that pathway forward for Surrey, and that is around workforce development. We've heard a lot about the need for reskilling and upskilling, and that this is an opportunity, particularly given where the job losses were centered on those young workers, that this is a tremendous opportunity to fill some of those those skills gaps and labor shortages we were experiencing before COVID in this end. So what we heard yesterday was training needs to be focused on industry needs. And I think you would have heard this before COVID as well, if you talk to industry about it. But the focus was really in the discussion is that right now we need to, in addition to having four-year degree programs, we also need to consider a wider menu of training options that are more accessible. And this could include things like vocational training and short skill specific programs. In the technology breakout, we heard a lot about just coding camps and little things where people were just got specific technical skills that then they could translate into a new position or into specific industries. The other thing about the focus on training and the reskilling is it needs to be inclusive of both the private and the public institutions. So our public institutions do a great job of delivering specific programming in specific areas, but there's also a role for the private institutions, the smaller private institutions, particularly around some of this vocational training potentially, where they're on the ground and they're providing some of that skill development, the basic skill development that isn't necessarily something that our public institutions are well designed to do. It may be a role for those private institutions. So we need to think a little bit, I think we need to think a bit differently and do a little bit more collaboration based on what we heard between the public and private institutions going forward to address some of those skill gaps. James, did you want to add anything to this before I turn it over to you?
No, I think you've covered it off there. It's it's really about being agile. So identify a need, look for a quick solution, try to meet that need. If we're talking about vocation or skill specific training, if you can match a need with the supply and then upskill and be able to respond into the economic recovery, you're going to win. So it's not surprising that it serves as a high need and a key issue.
Okay, great. And so James, I'll let you talk a little bit about the program as we progress through this journey, what our next steps are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Susan. So like Susan was talking about before, we've made it through the what's happening. We've made a really good dent, I think, into what does it mean. And this is the beginning. This is not the end. This is not a one and done summit, but getting a good additional focus where you have the backdrop of the 17 to 27 economic recovery or economic strategy. And some of it was confirmed is still relevant, can continue on. And then you've had the opportunity to identify new and emerging problems and issues that need to be attended to. That's the problem identification. So the we are here, is somewhere in between what does it mean and what should we do? So now is the time to start migrating towards the action planning. So developing the action plan based on information gathered and connecting the resources with the needs that are there to then drive forward to the results that are desired. The way forward on that and checking in with, is it working? And then checking again later further down the road, is it still working? The consistent theme here from the summit going into it, during, and even from the speakers is collaboration. Need to have a collaborative approach. There's the learning from each other that can happen. We hear a lot, and we heard some from Supesh and from Jill as well, on the innovation. Innovation typically is repurposing something or a combination of things we've found elsewhere to our particular needs. So the fastest way to find that is to collaborate, listen, and hear what's working somewhere else, and then bringing it into your own context to do that. So that's the collaborative planning to identify actions in each of those focus areas. So there's going to be common issues where you can achieve some economies of scale, and sector-specific issues where the benefit is going to be drawing from learnings from others. And then when you get some of those successes and learnings, share them across the sectors. That's going to be important for the ongoing collaboration. It's not one and done. It's not problem identification. We collaborated, good. Let's go off on our merry way. Coming back and sharing what those successes are breeds more success. So where there's no consensus emerged, and earlier in the other slides we identified where there's more work to be done to better understand the multitude of additional issues that came up. For the dialogue, get an understanding. You're still not moving from what does it mean to what are we going to do? And then, it's an age-old plan, do, check, act. Plans at the top of the slide. But then going forward, do it together, check it together, act together. The way forward is through collaboration. You've got a good start on the problem and issue identification. And now it's who's doing what on Tuesday to get moving and to start taking some of the actions that we already know we can do and convene and collaborate to better understand the ones that we need to discern and define so we can develop those action plans and do something about it. Thanks, everyone. That's the nature of the presentation of what we've got so far from the summit and the breakout sessions. With that, I'd like to turn it back to you, Haroon.
Thank you very much, Susan and James. Again, tremendous work done by both of you and the other MNP partners and team. So really appreciate it. And I love the idea. I think you hit it on the head. It's agile framework is what you've developed. And that's what we need to do in these times in order to get things done. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to sort of set the stage for our new Minister of Economic Development and Competitiveness, and that's the Honorable Michelle Mungall. And what I love about the appointment is one of the things that we need to do to create a resilient, not just economy, society, is we need to think about how we can support all the different socioeconomic groups. And so what I love about the minister's background is that before she got involved in politics, she was really involved in social justice. She was involved in financial security for the disenfranchised. And I know she did some very unique work with the YWCA in, I believe, in Zambia, and helping girls with AIDS. And so, Minister, I think your background sort of is very unique for what we're going to need to move the economy forward. And it's not just about same old figure about doing bottom line. I think we need to rethink and reimagine the economy to help all levels of society. So on that, what I'd like to have you maybe share with us is we know that that COVID is going to have a long-term impact on the economy. So maybe some of your thoughts on that. And also, what changes do you see in business related to the pandemic? And then, of course, both James and Susan talked about the whole area of reskilling large segments of the workforce. So maybe in your comments, Minister, you could address those points for us.
Thanks very much, Haroon, and thank you to MNP and Surrey Board of Trade for inviting me to listen in this morning and offer some thoughts of what's going on at the provincial level. You already heard from the Premier, but I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the issues that I've been hearing on the ground, along with what the Premier was speaking about. And I'm very pleased also to be joining you in this new virtual world. I'm coming to you from Nelson in my home community on the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa Nation. And so it's this experience, I would say, is going to be one of those lasting effects as a result of the pandemic, not just in terms of how we communicate, but it's really important for our economy. So Haroon, I want to touch on the points you made in the first two together, and then coming back to the reskilling. They're all related, as everybody knows, but that's how I want to kind of break them off in terms of how I'll talk about it. So jumping off from the very fact that we're all here together virtually, and from around the province, as I'm coming to you from about a good 8-hour drive away, is one of the things that I think is going to be a long-term impact is in telecommunications. And that in and of itself is going to be changing the way that businesses operate. No more are we going to think that everybody has to live in the exact same location to be able to go to work or to commute to work. We're going to see a lot more online commuting. And this is really important in two factors. One, it's going to force and enable reducing the divide between urban and rural connectivity. That is a major thing in BC right now. Only 33% of non-Indigenous and only 35% of Indigenous communities outside of the Lower Mainland have high-speed broadband internet. And so we have already put in with our previous budget, which I'm going to come back to the debt issue, as a long-term impact of, or an impact that's come out of the pandemic. But on the connectivity part, we put $50 million in as a government to start addressing this rural-urban divide around connectivity. We're getting signals from the federal government that they really want to ramp up their support of reducing that divide. And what that's going to mean is that commuting can be done virtually. So you can have somebody in the fastest growing sector of the Nelson economy, which is the tech sector, working perhaps in the Quantum Algorithms Institute and building up Surrey's tech sector from here in the Kootenays. That type of work is going to be able to take place more and more, but it won't just be the tech sector working on the tech sector. It's working with our traditional industries as well. So we know agriculture is a very prominent aspect of Surrey's economy. Same thing here out in the Kootenays. I represent the Creston Valley, which I'm going to not go into a lot of detail about, because once I get on a roll, I start talking about how it produces the best food anywhere in the world. But the opportunities to start marrying technology and agriculture so that we can have greater collaboration between different jurisdictions that are producing agriculture, but to also increase our production is going to be very important. And the ability to commute virtually is going to enable a lot of that. I said that I would touch on debt, and you asked about the long-term impacts. I think we have to point out, as the Premier did, that just a few months ago, our province was delivering a balanced budget, and that is definitely not the case anymore. And the increased government debt we're seeing all over the world, And we're seeing a lot of small businesses. It's one of the issues that come up regularly at the Small Business Roundtable. And we've been meeting very regularly over this pandemic period, is having to increase debt load. So that being a real factor, having to ensure that we have strong economic activity so that businesses are not collapsing under debt, that governments aren't collapsing under debt, is going to be very, very important. So we're going to have to think about ensuring that we do, as we recover, we are recovering in a way that is going to build a sustainability and a strength that perhaps we haven't always thought of in the past. And on that note, I mentioned about how innovation and tying innovation to our traditional industries, ensuring that we do it in a way that is globally competitive. And this is coming back to also increasing economic activity in the sense of, and this is how I say it, closer to home. And that kind of touches on the supply chain issue. What we've seen in this pandemic is real issues around supply chain for PPE, for example, but food security is becoming another big concern. And also larger industries are also thinking of diversifying their supply chain. So they're also looking to seek out inputs into their projects closer to home, closer to where the projects actually are. So we might be seeing greater diversification in supply chains, greater opportunity for businesses to retool and start depending on what kind of supply chain opportunities might be existing. And so I'm going to put forward in my crystal ball gazing is that BC is going to see a lot of opportunities for closer to home supply chains around food and food security, which again, very good for our agriculture industry, very good for our agri-tech industry, and very good for innovation opportunities in agriculture. But it's not just in food and food security that we're going to see opportunities for closer to home supply chain. Energy is another one. People want to have energy security, and we're very fortunate in British Columbia that we have BC Hydro and that we have 98% of our energy is already produced carbon free, but there's a desire to do that even more so, and that ties into our Clean BC plan. And I think that the pandemic has actually heightened the need for stable sources of energy closer to home and having renewable sources of energy closer to home. And then there's also major manufacturing industries that are needing fabricated steel, for example. They're wanting to get that closer to where they're actually doing the construction for their projects, and a variety of other things. And last but not least on that, on my example list is personal protective equipment, PPE. And Surrey Makes PPE is an excellent example of that desire to innovate and retool business and supply chains closer to home. And it's been just a fantastic success story and a really great example of how the pandemic impacts changing our economy and how we do business and how businesses will be changing. Another thing that I think is a significant change, I immediately I'm not surprised that it's come up here at the Surrey Board of Trade. Anita, the first time I ever heard you speak was at a finance committee meeting about 11 years ago, and it was very rare at that time for business organizations to bring up the importance of childcare to the economy. And that call has increased in steam and been amplified significantly over the last 10 years. But I've never, ever, as somebody who's advocated for childcare, I have never seen it so prevalent as I have in the last 3 months. This pandemic has shown all of our society how important childcare and early learning are to our economy, to our labor force. And so I'm really proud that our government has been a bit ahead of the curve on that one. We made that promise in the election and have a plan to deliver on that. But I think we're going to see not necessarily just from government, but we're going to see a broader social embracing of the importance of childcare, which will obviously result in good public policy, no matter who is in government. So I think that's a real positive. Coming to the reskilling, this is very, very, very important right now. Our last labor force survey told us that 353,000 jobs were either lost or put on hold during the pandemic. That is mind-bogglingly staggering number. And we know that the hardest hit areas in retail and wholesale sales, as well as tourism, are going to be some of the last places to come back online. And a lot of businesses might not be able to do so, which is very unfortunate. But in a private market, those forces take hold. And so we want to do our best in government to ensure that we are supporting businesses restarting, but that we are also supporting workers having the skills needed to get the jobs that those businesses are going to be asking for, because as we already highlighted, there's going to be we're already seeing the significant changes in what the skill demand is going to be. And so we don't want to end up in a situation where we have people without jobs and jobs without people. So we have to make sure that we have a reskilling program in place. And I know that our Ministry for Advanced Education and Skills Training has been working on this day and night, identifying ways in which we can be supporting the population and the reskilling opportunities. And I mean, your presentation just now highlighted that perfectly. Susan and James' points around the need to have some rapid reskilling, coding camps as an example, digital marketing boot camps that we've done here in my area in the Kootenays in Canal Flats, and 100% of the students from that program had jobs upon graduation. And so we need to be looking at what is it that industry needs, what do they need fast, how do we deliver it fast, and how do we work with our post-secondary institutions, both public and private, to deliver those needs. I'd also, this is a little bit out of the box, and I'd also offer it up for folks in Surrey to think about, and I see that my time is running out, but I will put this out there, is that the Innovation Commissioner, Dr. Alan Winter, in his final report to government, talked about precincts, and he talked about hubs for the tech sector. And an important part of those hubs and those precincts would be post-secondary education, having academia involved in the skills training. And I think we need to start thinking of how do we anchor different precincts around the province, and making sure that we have a good tech sector all throughout BC. And I think post-secondary institutions give us that opportunity, because that constant reskilling, that constant skill building and education is so important to innovation. And so using our post-secondary institutions all around the province to be at the forefront of skilling for innovation for the tech sector, I think provides us with the real opportunity. And I'm going to say that I think Surrey SFU has really shown us that in practice, the opportunities that are there. So good on to Surrey SFU for that great work. And last but not least, the Premier was talking about with phase 3 coming into phase 3. It would be terrible of me as a Kootenay MLA to not let you know that the Kootenays are a beautiful place to visit in British Columbia. And so anybody who is looking for a wonderful place to visit and to do so safely, we would love to see you. Our small businesses in the Kootenays rely on tourism, and we are a beautiful place in the summertime. So once again, Haroon, thank you so much for inviting me to sit in on the presentation this morning. I really appreciate it. You guys are doing fantastic work in Surrey. It's a really inspiration. Thanks a lot.
Well, Minister, thank you very much for taking the time out of your hectic schedule. And this is really the start of the journey. So we'd love to follow up with you and your team. And the idea is to connect government with not just SFU, but other academic institutions and business. So we look forward to collaborating with you and your team in the very near future here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
What I'd like to do now is I'd like to introduce, actually a perfect segue into this is our next speaker, who's probably one of the thought leaders in terms of the future of work. And I really struggled of how to introduce Zabeen, because if I went through all her background, she was a former Senior VP of HR at RBC, and if I went through all the boards she sat on, I'd probably use up all her time. So I'm going to very simply say, I got to know Zabeen, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. She, like me, is an executive in residence at Beedie, and she's an extremely thoughtful, and she's got great insights, which I think you'll enjoy listening to her. And part of the conversation with her will be about her thoughts, but I think one of the things that's coming out of this summit, which we've talked about doing, is Zabeen's also involved with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce Advisory Board, and they themselves are on a similar journey. So as we connect her to this initiative, we'll be able to sort of cross-fertilize and create innovation between those two areas. So Zabeen, do you want to just maybe quickly do an introduction of yourself?
I think you've covered it off. My mother's not here, so you don't need to go through the full bio. Maybe the thing that's not on my bio is I actually grew up in British Columbia. I moved there as a teenager with my family from Tanzania, and lived in Burnaby, North Vancouver, and a stint in Squamish. And worked at RBC while I was there, and actually did my high school there as well. And I'm a graduate of SFU. So it's nice to be back virtually.
Nice. And I do have a question. We were talking late last evening, even later for you, and you were complaining that you were worried about the birds waking you up. Did they do that this morning?
They did, 4:15 a.m. like clockwork.
Oh, there you go. So Zabeen, let's maybe start with the big picture. So over the last 2 days, we've talked about workforce development, and it's been a really important theme. And I know you've got some great insights into that. So would you maybe sort of kick it off with the big picture from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. And I was happy to be able to participate yesterday for a good chunk of time, and then this morning as well. So really, in terms of just thinking about tying them together, the two big themes that I see coming through on future of work, one is around reskilling and upskilling. The other is distributed workforce. What we often talk about is remote. And what I'd like to touch on maybe is, how do we take those from concept to action? I spent my career in the action world in many ways as the chief HR officer at RBC for 10 years. And I think we all agree that we need to collaborate, we need to work together, and we need to move to action. So some of the thoughts there that I thought I would put out is in terms of what we can do at scale, because that's really the big issue, is how do you scale this? We talked a little bit about the construction industry, for example. The Premier talked about that, and how that in British Columbia in particular didn't stop at all. And we're certainly seeing a lot of activity there. And we also know that the skilled trades has a retirement bubble coming up. And so when you put those two things together, what comes to mind to me is you look at the 250 odd thousand jobs in hospitality and in the services industry, in accommodation, et cetera, that have been lost. Can we actually do something at scale to transition a good number of those people, to train them, to accelerate the training, the apprenticeship, and move them into some of those jobs? A lot of the people who have lost jobs are young people as well. And what also needs to happen here is, I think there's a stigma around for some people around skills trades, for some communities. I know Surrey has a large new immigrant and refugee population, and sometimes there is a stigma around those jobs. So we need to also destigmatize them, and they're becoming increasingly tech, fused with tech. And what we often in Future of Work talk about, the fusion of humans and technology. And some of those jobs have certainly moved up into that space. That's one example. Another example, to make it real, is in the healthcare and personal care, personal support workers. We've seen that through COVID, a lot of things have been revealed, including the issues around long-term care, and we have the aging population. So think about some of the hospitality, people in the hospitality industry, for example. What's required to transition them faster, and what credentials can they come with already because of what they've been doing? How do we take their experience and credentialize that and move them into that space? And the third one that you've talked about, I like to talk in threes, is digital and tech skills. We just heard from the minister. She talked about some things like boot camps, et cetera. And what's happened here is COVID really has fast forwarded us to the future of work. And what we will most likely see is increased investments in digital, in digitizing and automating those as industry and retail goes back to work and to opening up. That will likely happen. The last 4 recessions saw an increase in investment in automation. So what are those digital skills, cybersecurity? How do you work with universities? In Ontario, for example, Ryerson University has worked with industry to develop a cyber program. Young people, again, we've got a lot of young people in this unemployed group, and how do we do those large-scale transitions? I wanted to, the other sort of parallel piece, the big stories around a distributed workforce and working from home. Interesting, on the Surrey survey, or the survey you did, I think I remember that it said 62% of companies said their people can work from home. Now that may be some of their people, not all, because that's certainly higher than we've seen. The national number through April, for example, was 42%. And that's generally what the surveys are showing us, that about 40% of people can work from home. A couple of points that I would make there. So as I mentioned, we had 5 million people working from home in April. It's important to take a balanced view. There are pros and cons for employees and for organizations. For employees, no commute, family time, more access to jobs. Again, we heard the minister talking about people don't have to live, people who live in suburban or rural or areas or the north. The cons are social isolation. Mental health was raised, and also the time blurring. People are saying that they're working longer hours. There was a Bloomberg study done that said people are working plus 3 hours extra a day. And so we have to be mindful of how that's managed. From a business point of view, reduced real estate footprint is certainly one of the big things. And on the con side, both pro and con, there is a greater access to talent when you've got a work from home. Your talent is also more accessible to other companies globally. And so this really becomes a competitive issue that needs to be managed. And it will drive things like, again, going back to the minister, how do we go from digital divide to digital provide? So my advice here to, as you're working through this in businesses, are start to collect data around how this is working, looking at things like productivity, innovation, and creativity. What we have seen is that for many organizations, they've created space where people come together, they sit together, they have these collisions, these unplanned collisions that spark new ideas, that spark new relationships. We haven't figured out how to do that yet virtually. We may be able to, we may not be able to. So collecting the data, and that could be done collectively. What are we learning? What are we seeing around productivity? Some say it's up, some say it's down. How do you manage culture? How do you change culture in this kind of an environment? And I see that as a great opportunity for collaboration across business and getting academia involved in getting some really good data, because many people are still going to be working from home for quite some time while physical distancing is required. So let's learn, let's make those decisions, and then let's test and learn as we move forward.
Those are great insights. So sort of building on that, one of the comments that it seems to be running through the thread of comments from many of the folks is the opportunity to sort of learn from, different industries and from to try to create innovation by getting best practices from other industries. You use a term, or I've heard you use a term called turbocharged collaboration and co-creation. Can you maybe a little bit expand on that for us?
Sure. So I think a perfect example right now of turbocharged collaboration and co-creation is the way BC has managed the COVID pandemic. What we've seen is people coming together, all levels of government, but government, business, and civil society. What I think we saw, and you've got a rock star chief medical officer in Dr. Bonnie Henry, but what we saw there is some really important leadership lessons as well. She was radically transparent. She didn't mince the truth, and she was also very clear about what she didn't know. She showed humanity, and then she provided the facts. That is that is the foundation of collaboration. When you are transparent, when you say, you know what, I don't have the answers to these things, and bring forth the humanity. And how do you bottle that? How do you actually take the way we behave in a crisis, which is we come together around common purpose? Right. And this is a lot of what you're trying to do here today. What is the common purpose and objectives? What can we align around? And once you get that alignment and everybody sees how ultimately that's going to be a win-win, then you move quickly though to action and co-creation. So that's the creating as you go and correcting as you go. And we have done that, and there's so many examples through COVID where we know it can be done. We take more calculated risks, for example. We aren't as worried about, well, if we get it wrong, we're going to get a lot of negative flack. And in politics in particular, that's a big piece. There's no time. The hierarchies came down. It was no longer about, I have to go through all of the chain and they get to the top of the line, they'll go to the top of the line somewhere else and it'll come back down. Instead, it became a hierarchy of knowledge, not a hierarchy of level or title. And what I will close off this collaboration, co-creation on, it really is based on that foundation of leadership and leaders stepping up to actually say, you know what, we're going to lead our own organizations, but we're also going to think about the greater good. Because when the economy grows and rises, we all benefit from that. It becomes a virtuous cycle. Advice here, pick something you can work on, maybe one of the big reskilling opportunities, and go through that model and then replicate that model. So it's a bit of a start, think big, start small, and scale fast kind of an approach.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, one of the things I found is, and you hit on it, is if you can get, so working inside a large global organization, driving transformation to them, I've discovered you need to get the various levels to focus together on a common goal, right? And once you do that, a lot of egos get set aside. And that's what I've actually found. You know, that's why we managed to make so much progress the last 3 weeks is, hey,
exactly,
right? We're in this together. Let's focus together. And so a lot of the speakers we had yesterday, and you attended the breakout sessions, a lot of those folks are actually tremendous leaders in themselves, and they've decided, hey, yes, you're right. Let's get that focus going. And then the other piece to that is creating the discipline, and that's creating that agile framework that, you know, James and Susan took us through. And that's a process or a methodology that you use. And then the third piece is creating that collaboration, right? Is getting all those various stakeholders, once they see the focus and they see we've got a framework to drive our content through, now you get them collaborating. And so one of the interesting things coming out of this, Zabeen, will be, can we quickly move, and I think we'll be able to here in BC. And then what I'd like to see going forward is, can we connect now with you in Ontario and the groups you're working with? And what I found is sometimes the more stakeholders you bring in, it just slows your process down. So you got to get that kernel, or you know, with the way we used to make snowmen when we were kids. You start with that little snowball, and then that's your core. On focus, discipline, and commitment, and then you turn it, and the more you turn it, the bigger it comes, and you reach a point that more and more people are pushing it forward, and the bigger it comes. So one of the things I do hope coming out of this will be that we can collaborate with you in Ontario and connect our government folks with your government folks, as well as obviously you and I are connected, and our business organizations. So that's,
and work from each other, right? And that's another sort of co-creation, and also that mindset of done is better than perfect. You just have to, you do, that's the agile framework, but you iterate and you make it better. But that's, I hope we don't lose that speed aspect that we've picked up through the last 100 days.
yes, that absolutely. And so I wanted to also sort of get your thoughts on, there's two other questions I wanted to talk to you, but I also want to be mindful of the time. Is we're talking about building a future of work. And I want to get your thoughts on that. But one of the big, I think, hot buttons right now in society is how do we become more inclusive? Because there's a lot of talk about being inclusive, but when I check all the boards, when I check senior executives, I go, there's not gender diversity, there's not ethnic diversity, there's quite honestly very little diversity. So I kind of threw that, given the time we've got, into maybe one question for you, if you don't mind addressing it that way.
Yeah, so maybe looking at it at two ends. The broader general population, to start with, we've heard multiple times that this is a she session. Women have been more affected. Young people have been more affected. New immigrants have been more affected. And certainly that would, I'm sure, has played out in the Surrey area as well. And so what we do there really to help them back into the workforce in rapid ways, but it's often going to need an ecosystem around it. Childcare, for example, was brought up. Sometimes that can make it difficult for people to actually get their reskilling done. And the point I would make there is when we create those environments where everyone can realize their full potential and be productive, they win, but so do their organizations and so does the economy. So it's not just a nice thing to do or the right thing to do, but it's actually the smart thing to do. To your point around leadership, and I think for inclusion to really be real and for people to see that the possibility that really then drives them and fuels them to be even more ambitious, the representation matters a lot. And couple of thoughts there. I would say, first of all, it's looking at the criteria. So if I look at boards, one of the things that happened was many corporate boards a few years ago, their criteria was very narrow, and typically they looked for people who were sitting or previous CEOs. Well, the problem is there were mostly men. And not the problem, but there were no women. Right. And that criteria got changed, where they started to look at presidents, division heads, university presidents, and don't tell me they don't have massive jobs. And all of a sudden, the pool of what they were looking at changed. I think that and those are actually systemic barriers.
Right.
And I would look at those boards through that lens. I am also a strong believer in setting goals. Goals are not the same as quotas. Just like anything important in business, you set goals and then you take action to get there, but you make smart decisions. You don't just decide. I mean, I'm a banker. I come from banking, as you know, and I would often say we set goals for mortgage growth. It doesn't mean that you put mortgages on the books that don't meet good lending criteria. And talent is the same thing. But when you have goals, you achieve more. And I think it's time that we do that for boards, that we require organizations. You start by doing voluntary goals. You goal setting. You ask organizations to set the goals themselves and then hold themselves accountable, because there's nothing like going public on goals that drives organizations and institutions to take that action. And it applies on public sector boards as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think those are really practical. I love the way you just articulated that about not quotas, they're goals, and they're measurable goals. And the analogy you use, I think, is a very effective way, because that's what I hear. I go, well, you know, why do we want to set quotas when the capabilities aren't going to be there? But the way you've identified how to get through that problem is I think very insightful. So what I'd like to...
sorry, just one thing to finish that analogy. And banks have provisions for loan losses, and the same applies with talent decisions. There's always people who aren't going to work out, men, women, people of different ethnicities, and sometimes that's forgotten. And it becomes when a woman or a minority fails, well, that was a diversity hire. Well, the same thing happens with men as well. So those are things to watch out for. Sorry, I couldn't miss a chance to get that in.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know we got about 1 minute left. I apologize. We've kind of run out of runway. I think in my dialogues with you, I look forward in a later date actually doing a whole session, with part of this process that we've created here. And so, because I think you've got a lot to offer. What one or two messages would you like to leave us with, since you sat through the 2 days to go to operationalize this?
So that's the key, operationalize. I think it's really, really important to pick something that you see collaboration, business, government, academia, not-for-profits, and civil society, and just get going on it. Something that's reasonably, no, there are things where we don't need more data. Get going, learn as you go, but pick up on the momentum that you've created to really learn how to collaborate better and see the power of it and create a model that you can then replicate for your other pieces. And be inclusive in that process as you are today.
Well, I'm so glad you articulated that, because what I'm going to do is put you, I, and our good friend Kirk Hill and KPU and other organizations in Surrey to work. And because I think reskilling could be potentially, one of those areas. So on that, Zabeen, I wanted to thank you very much for joining this conversation, providing your insight. And although you live in Toronto, the beauty of working virtually now, we can get a hold of you anytime and get you supporting our initiatives here in BC, which I know is still deep in your heart, your home.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I see there's lots of questions. I'm happy if you send them to me to respond to them separately.
That's great. And yeah, we'll make sure that you get those questions, Zabeen. Thank you very much. So on that, I want to be, in terms of wrap up, I want to sort of be respectful of the time that we have here and not repeat. I think over the last 2 days, we've got a very clear-cut input from a number of different stakeholders. I think we have a pretty good plan in place. As James and Susan identified, we've taken 2 steps in what is a very long journey. And you just heard me articulate to Zabeen, one of the things that's coming out to me certainly is this whole area of reskilling. And I'm not suggesting that's the first step we take, because we've got to go back with the various stakeholders, including the government, but that could be an area that we could focus in on. But really in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we need to get past the summit and keep walking and moving forward if we want to keep the momentum. And in terms of talking about momentum, as I hand it over to Anita, would you like to turn on your screen? Anita, I mean, I think you heard it. You've heard it from me. You've heard it from a number of the people that you've had on our various panels stuff. You've heard it from the Premier. You've heard it from the Minister. I don't think, I sat on the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade for a number of years, as you know. I live in Surrey, it's my home, but I want to give you kudos, because I don't think you've gotten enough credit in our community as a whole in terms of how you've been a champion and you've been a change agent. And so I think on behalf of everybody in the business community, on behalf of MNP, of SFU, and everybody who went through these last 2 days, thank you very much for, as you know, when I approach you, you looked at it and go, wow, this is really risky. It could cost me my job. You didn't quite say that, but you understood that it was a tremendously risky kind of situation. And I think we've done a very good job of pulling it together and moving it forward. And thank you for hosting us and doing so.
Thank you very much, Haroon. And really, the bridge between government, business, and education has always been part of our strategic philosophy at the Surrey Board of Trade. We are Surrey's city building business organization, and collaborating with the BIAs and the chambers, and of course our provincial and national business network really puts our industry for the Board of Trade and the Chamber of Commerce as the focal point for economic recovery during very uncertain economic times. And so you heard it from MNP, where we are going to be looking at what we found yesterday, what we found through also our Surrey workforce strategy that we released in partnership with the BC government last October, and looking at the future, looking at some action items that we can have a quick win, but some things are going to be a long-term goals as well, even in the face of great adversity. So the sectors that we focused on yesterday, manufacturing, health, technology, manufacturing, and creative arts and economy to really enhance the livability of our city was so important, because we are trying to make Surrey an opportunity city. It already is, and we look very much forward to working with education, with government, with business, with the not-for-profit sector to drive the agenda of innovation, digital transformation forward. Thank you so much to our sponsors of the Surrey Economic Recovery Summit. Our premier sponsor is MNP, and our gold sponsor is SFU Surrey, of course, right here in Surrey, British Columbia, and the SFU Beedie School of Business. And our supporting sponsors, our silver sponsors, are Kwantlen Polytechnic University and the Port of Vancouver. And our bronze sponsor is the Downtown Surrey Business Improvement Association. Just a reminder that both sessions, day 1 and day 2, were recorded, and the slides will be sent to you after the session is over. It will be posted on our website at businessinsurrey.com. So look forward to more information, more engagement, more action during the summer and into the fall. And remember, the Surrey Board of Trade is here for you. Thank you so much for being here on Canada's first Economic Recovery Summit. Make it a great business day and a great weekend.